Now I'm just waiting for the signal. I'm really glad everybody can come today. Okay, well, welcome to everybody here, as it were, at the LSE, and all of you who are joining us from YouTube from far and wide. This is the beginning, the launch of the Lent term of the Cutting Edge series in development thinking and practice. And we have a great lineup over the next 5 weeks of speakers. And so we hope you'll all join us at 4 o'clock each week. The way we're going to work is we'll have our speaker, then followed by a discussant. I just want, while you're all here, to announce that next week, Akosua Adomako Ampofo will be speaking on decolonizing academe. And then we have others, look on our website, lined up, including Kate Rayworth on donut economics. We have the UN Deputy Secretary General coming to speak to us before the end of this series. So we're looking forward to the rest of the series. Now, it really gives me huge pleasure to welcome back to the LSE, Ha-Joon Chang. Most of you who are studying development have already read quite a few of his works. Particularly, you all know his famous book, Kicking Away the Ladder, Development Strategy and Historical Perspective. You know, that book rightly won in 2003 the Gunnar Myrdal Prize for Best Monograph by the European Association for Evolutionary Political Economy. And this book has really had a profound influence throughout the world. I remember one time when I was doing field research in Rwanda about 15 years ago, and I went into a small grocery shop, and they only had a few books on sale, and one of them was Kicking Away the Ladder. So I took a photo of it and sent it back to Ha-Joon. You all know as well his Economics, the User's Guide, which has helped so many non-economists to understand basic economic ideas and theory, but also economists to look at their discipline in a new way and perhaps begin to understand economic ideas. His Cambridge Journal of Economics article, Breaking the Mold, an Institutional Political Economy, Alternative to the Neoliberal Theory of the Market and the State, is a landmark article, and many of you have already read it. Students studying with me will be looking at the debate he's had over industrial policy in recent years. And in 2005, Ha-Joon was awarded jointly with Richard Nelson of Columbia University the Leontiev Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought. This is an incredibly prestigious award, and it was well deserved. I'm also extremely happy to welcome Dr. Richard Wright, who's director of the Globalization and Development Strategies Division at UNCTAD. He's also worked at the United Nations in New York and Geneva. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge, and he's published widely on economic issues in the Economic Journal, the Cambridge Journal of Economics, the Journal of Development Studies, and the Oxford Review of Economic Policy. His latest book is The Resistible Rise of Market Fundamentalism, an important contribution. I encourage you all to have a look at it. You know, I remember seeing just at the end of the year, I think it was in the last week of December, Richard being quoted in the New York Times. He said, "It's clear that developing countries, and especially poorer developing countries are going to be excluded for some time, talking about access to the vaccine in this current pandemic. So despite the understanding that vaccines need to be seen as a global good, the provision remains largely under control of large pharmaceutical companies in the advanced economies. It's really quite important to us that Richard's given up his time to come here, a major figure in his own right, as a discussant on Ha-Joon's talk. So without further ado, Ha-Joon, I want to turn the floor, as it were, over to you to talk to us with this intriguing title of engaging with multilateralism in terms of casting a new economic order. So, over to you.
Thank you, James, for that very kind introduction. In talking about the kicking the ladder, I cannot not mention James's critical catalytic role in the creation, because the book really started with him pushing me and linking me up with the defeat in writing part of the book as a report, basically chapter 3 of the book on the history of institutional development in the rich countries, and that became the kind of start of the book. So he's very much responsible for whatever good or bad the book has done. And yeah, I'm really happy to have Richard as my discussant today. Richard and I go back a long way. We studied PhD together in Cambridge. Richard was 1 year ahead of me under the same supervisor, Bob Rothen. And we've been, since the late 1980s, sharing so many ideas and working together. So it's really gratifying to be able to talk with James presiding and Richard being the commentator. Earlier this week, we had the inauguration of Joe Biden, and that has frankly led to a huge collective sigh of relief in, well, basically every country in the world. And I mean, there are so many aspects to this change, but in terms of international economy, the global governance, there's a hope that the US will abandon the isolationist approach taken under Donald Trump and revive its commitment to multilateralism. And indeed, Biden has decided to take the US back to the Paris Accord on climate change, back to the WHO's COVAX program. So I think there's some kind of justification for having that hope, but actually when it comes to economic issues, international trade, investment, intellectual property rights, it's not clear whether the Biden administration will take a fundamentally different approach to the Trump administration. Because really, I mean, the US, together with other rich countries, have been drifting away from multilateralism way before Donald Trump came on the scene. And I'll get into that in a minute, but when the WTO was launched in 1995, the rich countries said that they were totally committed to the idea of multilateralism. Of course, multilateralism was already put in place to an extent with the Bretton Woods system, the creation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank back in 1944. We can talk about them, but today I'm not going to talk about them and focus on the WTO. And at that time, it looked like their renewed commitment to multilateralism was quite kind of impressive, because they, for the first time, accepted the introduction of a one country, one vote system in the WTO, the World Trade Organization. You know, the UN, in some issues that you have the one country, one vote, but ultimately the 5 permanent members of the Security Council have veto, so it's not fully democratic. The World Bank and the IMF run like companies. It's a $1, one vote. I mean, slightly adjusted, but essentially that your power there is determined by your paid-in capital. But in the WTO, they created an unprecedented system, which is one country, one vote. So in theory, the developing countries could vote against the rich countries and have their way. Now, initially, there was, as a result, a lot of hope. But it soon turned out that this commitment to multilateralism was basically cosmetic. You know, well, most people in the audience are probably too young to remember it, but James Wood, Richard Wood, Duncan Wood, you know, in the initial ministerial meetings of the WTO, Seattle 99, Cancun 2003, Hong Kong 2005, there was so much problem with the way all the important decisions were made in the so-called green rooms. Yeah? So these are totally unofficial meetings that include only the rich countries and a number of developing countries that cannot be ignored, like India and Brazil and so on. And there were reports that delegates from lesser developing countries that were trying to get into the room were barred from it by security guards. And yeah, soon it became so obvious that the rich countries had no intention of letting the majority decide the outcome. And initially, the rich countries that tried to kind of ram through quite controversial proposals through the WTO. One was MIA, or Multilateral Investment Agreement. So this is that kind of putting huge restrictions on the member countries' regulation of foreign direct investment. So you could say there is TRIMS, or trade-related investment measures plus, or later the so-called NAMA proposal, the non-agricultural market access proposal, which allegedly gave greater access to agricultural markets of the rich countries in return for developing countries cutting their industrial tariffs. I mean, I don't have time to go into this. I'll be happy to talk about them in the Q&A session if anyone's interested. But these were very lopsided proposals, and the rich countries tried to ram through this, ram this through the WTO. But the one country, one vote structure gave the ability to developing countries to resist these proposals. So by like 2005, 2008, it was clear that the rich countries couldn't get their way through in the WTO as they had imagined, then they basically started to abandon their commitments to multilateralism without shame. So even before the Trump administration, the US had effectively pulled itself out of the WTO and had been focusing on getting bilateral agreements and regional agreements like TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. The EU may not have rejected multilateralism as openly as the US, but it also has actively engaged in divide and rule. You know, for example, when the WTO ruled that in the late 1990s that the Lome Convention, which gave professional trade treatment to the so-called ACP countries, African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, basically Europe's former colonies. When this was decided, the EU was told to make the agreement into something that is compatible with the WTO. And when that happened, the EU proposed to replace it with another agreement called EPA, or Economic Partnership Agreement. But this agreement, in negotiating this agreement, it deliberately divided the ACP countries into 7 regional subgroups instead of negotiating with all 79 ACP countries together, because, you know, divided, these developing countries are much weaker. Yeah? So instead of negotiating with the 79 countries, they will negotiate with, I don't know, 14 Caribbean countries, 11 Central African countries, 7 East African countries, and so on. And it made it a lot easier for them to push through their proposals. Eh? And in some of these groups, the negotiating capacity was so weak. The rumor has it that in negotiating EPA agreement with the Central Africa group, the EU actually wrote the position paper of the Central African group, yeah? Because they just didn't have the capacity to write the opposition paper. And EU said, here's our report, here's your report, which we wrote for you. Let's negotiate. Yeah? I mean, what kind of negotiation is that? Anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is that the multilateral trading system has been already falling apart, and it is in the interest of developing countries to revive it, because their only bargaining power is in numbers. Yeah? But in reviving multilateralism, it is not enough to return to the WTO system, as some quote unquote liberals that try to argue, because in my view, the WTO system has inherent biases against developing countries, and it needs to be radically reformed if it's to be truly pro-developmental. And this is the proposal that I want to discuss today. And in doing this, I very much drawn the ideas behind the so-called new international economic order, which was called for by the United Nations 47 years ago, back in 1974, under the intellectual leadership of Raul Prebisch, the first executive secretary of UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, for which Richard is the chief economist. Now, as you all know, the WTO system is based on the principle that free trade is the best for all countries under all circumstances. But free trade between countries at different levels of economic development is harmful in the long run for countries that are economically less developed. In the short run, in most cases, free trade will allow all trading partners to maximize their output and income. But that's only for the short term when you take these countries' productive capabilities as given. In the long run, free trade hampers the development of the less developed trading partners by making it impossible for them to create capabilities in high productivity, high technology industries. And this is, of course, the logic of infant industry, which has formed the basis of development policy in virtually all of today's rich countries. Let me share my screen from now on. As I show in these books, and I know that many of you have, but read at least some of these books and my other writings. So I'm not going to go into this so much. But basically, these books that show that today's developed countries use protectionism, government subsidies, restrictions on foreign direct investment, violation of other countries' intellectual property rights, all the things that the WTO either ban or make very difficult to use in order to develop their economies. So I'll be happy to share this PowerPoint later. So I'm just going to quickly show you, these things that the restrictions on tariffs in the WTO, restrictions on the regulations on FDI, trims in the WTO, restrictions on requirement that you need to protect intellectual property right strongly, embodied in the TRIPS agreement, in the WTO. These are all things that go against the very own the history of today's rich countries that lecture developing countries not to use them. I think that I would just spare all the details and give you one striking example that illustrate how this logic of infant industry protection is so vital in enabling, although not guaranteeing, economic development of developing nations. The famous Korean automobile manufacturer Hyundai started production back in 1969. It was initially a construction company, made a bit of money by building roads in Vietnam during the Vietnam War in the 1960s. And yeah, it wanted to do better things, so set up a car company. Its initial production in 1969 was 2,000 cars a year. In that same year, General Motors alone produced 4.4 billion cars. So if Korea had free trade with the US at the time, Hyundai would have been wiped out literally overnight. It just would not have survived. So it needed initially very heavy protection, government subsidies, direct and indirect, heavy restrictions on foreign direct investment in the auto industry and so on. Now, if someone took the time machine and went back to 1969 and told people, look, there's this 2-bit automobile company in South Korea, more of a glorified garage, producing 2,000 cars today, but give it 45 years, it'll be bigger than General Motors. If someone said that, that person would have been locked up in a lunatic asylum. because it's just not possible for something like that to happen. But this is exactly what happened. As of 2015, Hyundai has been producing more cars than General Motors. So this is the power of the infant industry protection. And I'm not saying that the infant industry protection guarantees economic success. It's the minimum condition that you need. But that without it, basically there's no hope of development. So the history of today's rich countries, starting from 18th century Britain down to today's South Korea, tell you that the current WTO rule is totally incompatible with development, the economic development of developing nations. And this principle needs to be embodied in any, in any pro-developmental global economic order. And I call this principle asymmetric protectionism. Basically, the idea is not the kind of universal protectionism that people like Donald Trump have been arguing, but the principle is that economically weaker countries are allowed to protect and regulate more than the stronger countries. And they'll be expected to reduce the use of these extra policy measures gradually as their economies develop. And I think that principle needs to be at the heart of any pro-developmental global economic system. Now, when I say this, many people say, oh, but that's unfair. We need a level playing field in a multilateral system. And indeed, the level playing field, it is like the, well, as the Americans say, the motherhood and apple pie. It is something that is definitionally good, that it seems impossible to oppose it, but I say that it's something that we need to oppose if we are going to build a world economic system that is truly pro-developmental. Now, of course, the level playing field is the right principle when the two teams in, say, a football game are equal. So if the Argentinian national team and the Brazilian national team plays a football match and the ground is tilted, so Argentinians attack from up the hill and Brazilians have to attack from down the hill, it is unfair. But when the players are unequal, level playing field is the wrong principle to apply. You know, if one team in a football game is the Brazilian national team and the other team is made up of, I don't know, bunch of 11-year-old girls, it would be only fair that the girls attack from up the hill and the Brazilians that attack from down the hill. Of course, that in real life, you don't see that kind of football match, exactly because we don't allow unequal players compete against each other in the first place. You know, there are age divisions, gender divisions. And in many sports that you have weight classes, you know, boxing, wrestling, weightlifting. So the heavier players not allowed to compete directly against the lighter players. And in the lighter weights of boxing, like the flyweight, featherweight, the weight band is only 2 to 3 pounds, 2 to 3 pounds, meaning 1 to 1.5 kilos. So in boxing, we think a guy who's 2 kilograms heavier than the other guy, hitting the other guy is so wrong that we make it structurally impossible for these two people to compete in the same ring. And in economics, we think, yeah, that Honduras, Guinea-Bissau, they should all compete on the same terms with Switzerland and the US. I mean, how absurd is that? Now, of course, when I say this, that the defenders of the current global economic system argue, oh, but there's the provision for SDT, or special and differential treatment. So whatever unfairness there is already dealt with. Actually, this SDTs make only minimal allowances. You know, the least developed countries, roughly countries under with per capita income under $1,000, they are allowed some the extra provisions. So, for example, export subsidies that other countries cannot use, they are allowed to use. But these extra provisions are very few. And when it comes to other developing countries that are not LDCs, the only allowance they have is that they can take longer time to introduce the WTO rule. Yeah? But they have to follow the same rules in the end. I mean, they might have extra 5 years, 10 years to introduce those rules, but basically they have to compete on the same rules as the rich countries. And more importantly, I would argue that it is wrong to use the word special in special and differential treatment. You know, it's a bit like calling, I don't know, stair lifts for wheelchair users or braille writings for blind people special treatment. No, these are not special treatment. These are differential treatments for different countries with different needs and capabilities. This has to be established. The rich countries are not doing favor by giving these extra provisions. It has to be understood that something that is integral to a fair global economic system. Yeah? This principle of asymmetric protectionism. So I would argue that a truly pro-developmental multilateralism needs to provide the maximum possible amount of policy space in which countries can pursue policies according to their own capabilities and their own needs. And this is what has to be at the foundation of what I call due international economic order. Now, people who know the history of the earlier NIEO, New International Economic Order, will probably try to remind me that actually things are even worse for this kind of the systemic reform, because that the conditions for a fairer global system are worse today than it was in the 1970s. And there are some reasons that to say that, you know, for example, in the 1970s, post-colonial guilt still lingered. You know, many African countries became independent only in the 1960s and early 70s. some of the Portuguese colonies in Africa were not even independent at the time. So, there were a lot of colonial guilt on the part of the rich countries, which made them less aggressive. Also, at the time, there was that systemic competition between the capitalist bloc and the socialist bloc, and some developing countries were able to get some concessions by playing this game cleverly. India was an example when the Americans wouldn't give them the right concessions, necessary foreign aid, it would threaten and often actually do threaten to go to the Soviet Union and got concessions from there. Also, the very pushback against the NIO during the neoliberal period has made some ideas in the NIO very difficult to implement. For example, the best example is that Richard knows about this far more than I do. That during the 1970s, there's a call for code of conduct for transnational corporations initiated by the United Nations. Now, during the neoliberal era, this has been completely turned against and became TRIMS. So basically, in the 70s, people are discussing how you introduce code of conduct for the transnational corporations. But by the 90s, there were actually not just code of conduct, but the international rules restricting what the developed individual countries can do in relation to the transnational corporations. It's the complete turnaround. And last but not the least, the dominance of neoliberal ideology in the last few decades has made the developing countries more accepting, far more accepting of the international economic order than they were in the 1970s. So I am acutely aware of these changes, but there are also the factors that are pulling in the other direction. First of all, there have been significant changes in the world economy. The developing countries now have much more weight in the global economic system. In 1974, high-income countries accounted for nearly 4/5 of the world economy. Today, they don't even account for 2/3 of it. And this trend will be accelerated by the pandemic, because as I'll go back to later, a lot of rich countries basically messed up their pandemic management. A lot of developing countries have managed it very well. And, a lot of the rich countries are going to shrink by 10% or more in 2020. Many developing countries have been able to contain their contraction to low one-digit percentage. So the weight of the world economy will shift more and more towards the developing world, which will give them more bargaining power. And also the interaction between the developing countries have become much more important than in the 1970s. For one thing, South-South trade has increased a lot. I couldn't quite get the figures for the 70s, but even compared to the mid-90s, the beginning of the WTO system, only 42% of world trade was South-South trade, that is trade between developing countries. By the mid-2010s, it had risen to 57%. And many of you will say, oh, but that's China. But that is the only part of the story. South-South trade, excluding China, was around 35% in the mid-1990s. In the mid-2010s, it was 42%. So yeah, the big part of it was the rise of China, but even excluding China, actually this had risen quite a lot. Also in the recent period, China, India, and some other developing countries have emerged as important international financial actors in lending, foreign aid, FDI. You know, even 20 years ago, the foreign aid was something that countries in Europe and North America and Oceania gave, not something that countries like China and India give. Yeah, I mean FDI, same story. You know, but now that they are emerging as the important financial actors, and they will become more important. And thirdly, although a bit less important in practice, now we have Southern-led international financial institutions like the New Development Bank, formerly the BRICS Bank, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So you know, in the 80s and 90s, there's literally only one bank in town called the World Bank. And if you didn't like it, if they didn't like you, you just didn't have any access to any money. Now that's not true. Yeah? You can get the bilateral loans from the Chinese government. You can get that foreign investment from India. You can get that multilateral loans from Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Yeah? So all of these mean that developing countries are less dependent on the rich countries, and therefore can be more forceful in their demands for a new international economic order. There have also been changes in ideas. You know, the NIO might have failed in the political sense, but some of the ideas that were embodied in it, which were at the time considered outrageous, now have become mainstream without people realizing it. You know, this 0.7% GDP target for foreign aid for the rich countries. This was already something that was this was something that was already proposed in the NIO proposal. At the time, it was considered ridiculous. Some countries have already attained it. You know? During the NIO, there were calls for cancellation of debts for developing countries. It was poo-pooed as a pipe dream, but a lot of debts, of course, nowhere near enough, have been cancelled, most notably through the so-called HIPIC initiative. And a one country, one vote system, which was called for during the days of NIO in the international organizations, which then was considered absolutely ridiculous, was introduced in the WTO, although, as I already said, the rich countries have found this very inconvenient and have been kind of abandoning it. But, you know, these are very significant changes in what we see as something legitimate, something normal, something feasible. In addition to the ideas from the NIO itself, some of the recent changes have shaken the legitimacy of neoliberal ideas. The 2008 global financial crisis, of course, it has actually resulted in very little actual change. because of the very strong the resistance from the financial sector, which is very, very powerful. But in terms of the legitimacy of the ideas, that experience has totally kind of eroded people's trust in the efficacy of open, deregulated financial markets. And the macroeconomic policy conducted since the crisis, especially those innovative monetary policies such as extremely low interest rates and quantitative easing, that people don't often realize how this prolonged low interest rate is something totally unprecedented in the history of capitalism. For the last 12 years, interest rates have been at the lowest level in the history of capitalism. And that kind of monetary policy totally goes against the neoliberal orthodoxy, although neoliberals try to pretend that they have always been open to this kind of idea. So that the financial crisis has quite seriously challenged the legitimacy of neoliberal ideas, and the more recent COVID-19 crisis has invalidated many of the conventional neoliberal ideas regarding the role of the government. In the last year or so, all the rich countries have subsidized and de facto nationalized companies. They have paid employment subsidies. In Britain, we call it the furlough scheme. Basically, the government paying up to 80% of the workers' wages if the company retains them. Can you imagine a capitalist government working with the neoliberal principle paying 80% of someone's wages? I mean, this is socialization of employment. Even that the anti-poor Trump administration was compelled to send income subsidies. A lot of countries have beefed up the income subsidies and unemployment benefits. There are the protections for self-employed workers, which in many countries have been outside the welfare system. Huge budget deficits. The German government, famous for its fiscal orthodoxy, has temporarily suspended this law that puts the ceilings on public debt. So just about every orthodoxy in the neoliberal playbook has been abandoned or turned on its head. And yeah, at the moment they are seen as emergency measures, but when the pandemic is over, this will change the terms of debate on the role of the government. I mean, this has happened in the past that after major crises, after the First World War, I mean, a lot of countries got used to the idea that women could work in factories. I mean, after the Second World War, welfare state was accepted as something completely central to a good society and so on. So, that these changes will come. I mean, of course, at this moment, I cannot predict, no one can predict how this will play out. But what are being done at the moment will have significant effect on what becomes legitimate, what becomes normal, and so on. And finally, there are something's going. Yeah, okay. Contingent factors. By calling them contingent, I don't mean less important or marginal. It's just that these are things that are not kind of integrally tied up with the global economic system. But there are these contingent factors that work in favor of a NNIEO, new international economic order. And first of them, I would say, is climate change, because the urgency of the problem is making us realize that the humanity is bound up in a common fate, and as a result, putting increasing pressure on the rich countries to do more to help developing countries, especially through large-scale transfer of technologies for climate mitigation and adaptation. So this is kind of creating pressure for greater international cooperation, recognition of the common fate of the humanity. And then there's the China factor. China is in a historically unprecedented position of being a major actor in the global economy while still being a developing country. No country has been in this position. China used to account for not even 3% of global economy in 1974. And today it accounts for 16%, and that's for 2018. So, with the pandemic, the rich economies are shrinking by 10, 12%, China growing at, I don't know the exact figure, a couple of percent. I mean, that will have up the Chinese share probably by 2% points. And this will likely continue. Now, China's unique status as a global economic actor that still is a developing country, and at that one with the socialist past, with all the baggage of the non-aligned movement and international brotherhood and so on. These things makes it behave rather differently from other big economies. So in terms of its aid policy, approach to foreign direct investment, approach to infrastructural development, it has a very different viewpoint. And it puts far fewer conditions on its loans and aids. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't an element of dependency type of relationship between China as a manufacturing nation and other developing countries as raw material exporters. I mean, there is an element of that. And in some aspects, China is behaving worse than the rich countries. For example, when it constructs infrastructure, it brings a lot of workers from China. Yeah? So the local population don't even get the benefit of working in a construction site. So I'm not saying that China somehow, an angel, as a good Korean whose ancestors have been bullied by everyone inside, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Russians, the Mongols, the Manchus, and more recently the Americans. I have no kind of favor for any of these big countries, but China is different, and that does make a difference. Yeah? Also, just because China is there as a different actor, it gives developing countries greater bargaining power. As I said earlier, in the 1980s, there was only one bank in town. And there was basically no bargaining power on the part of the developing countries. Now that they have that. So the China factor will create different dynamics. And last but not least, two, why is it not? Sorry, yeah. Yeah, there are quite a few typos here. Yeah, continued shouldn't be there. COVID is misspelled. Sorry about this mess. Yeah, and then there are things that will change international the political economy that come from the COVID-19 crisis. First is that the pandemic has heightened our awareness of humanity's common fate. You know, we basically realize that unless everyone is safe, no one can be truly safe, because we are now so bound up with each other. And that the realization of common fate that had already been growing because of the challenges of climate change, I think it will change global political dynamic. But also mishandling of the COVID crisis by the rich countries is seriously changing how developing countries see the rich countries. You know, at the time of this talk, well, according to the Johns Hopkins statistics, which I think is the most reliable, COVID-19 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants were 140 in the UK, 124 in the US, and 107 in France. In contrast, the corresponding numbers are 0.04 in Vietnam and Tanzania, 1.24 in Rwanda, and 1.87 in Ethiopia. Now, this is a huge, huge difference. Of course, when you give these numbers, people say, "Oh, but you know, the poor countries, they cannot collect data as well. Some of them have one-party state, repressive government." Okay, let's suppose that Vietnam has the underreported COVID-19 deaths by 100 times, which will be impossible because in this age of internet, you know, you cannot hide something like that. But yeah, let's say that they have underreported by 100 times. Its death rate per 100,000 people is still 4. You know, 1/30 of the US's, yeah, 1/35 of the UK's, yeah. So, you know, that you see this stark contrast where countries that used to lecture these poor countries like Vietnam and Tanzania and Ethiopia how to run their society, these countries have totally mismanaged this pandemic, and many developing countries are revising their view of this rich countries, I mean, which in many cases happen to be their former colonial masters. You know, centuries of history of colonialism, imperialism, economic domination, and cultural indoctrination have convinced people in developing countries, and I used to be one of them when I was living in South Korea, that, you know, everything runs perfectly in the US. You know, Britain is the country that invented human rights. Yeah, I mean, France is the epitome of human civilization. You know, these countries seeing those countries falling apart in the most dramatic way are now reassessing their view of those countries. They are slowly overcoming this inferiority complex that they have held for centuries. And once this change in perspective takes hold, developing countries will no longer demur to rich countries in the same way they used to. And this is, I think, subtly, but very importantly, going to change the international political dynamic. No more lecturing from countries like the US and the UK to developing countries how to run a good society. So I think that's something that is slowly developing, but could potentially have even bigger impacts than shifting economic balances. Okay, I'm running out of time, so let me conclude. So, developing countries need a pro-developmental multilateral world economic order, which I have called NNIEO. This has to be based on the principle of asymmetric protectionism and should maximize the policy space. There are factors that work against the realization of this ideal, but there are also other factors that could potentially facilitate it. Of course, that these things do not automatically happen. That countries have to create the common vision. They have to act together. They have to negotiate. So, I'm not saying that this is the result of this is a foregone conclusion, but I think that there are reasons to believe that this is a time to call for a new international economic order and work towards that. And there are reasons to believe that this might be actually far more feasible than what many people think. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Ha-Joon, thank you so much for that. As usual, extremely insightful, sharp analysis. Richard, can I call on you to respond? Thanks.
Thanks, James, and thanks to Ha-Joon. It's always difficult. Ha-Joon presents things in a kind of encyclopedic way, which it's always very difficult to know where exactly to intervene, especially as I agree with a lot of what he says. I will be slightly more jaundiced than he is. I think the challenges are even greater than he suggests. And I think this, despite his encyclopedic presentation, there's something really big missing from his story, which makes the challenges we face even more difficult. Partly, as he recognized, I think, in his introductory remark, but it's the role of finance and finance capital in shaping the multilateral system in ways that I think make it even more difficult to forge the kind of progressive agenda that he rightly says is desperately needed given the kinds of challenges that we face on the climate, economic, health fronts. So let me, and I'll come back to Joe Biden at the end of that, I think, if I can, given Ha-Joon started with Biden. I mean, I guess at the heart of Ha-Joon's story is this disconnect between the dominant narrative of which I'm sure all students have heard about, the liberal international order, the kind of rules-based order that has been gradually perfected over the course really of the last 100 years, beginning with Wilson and his ideas at the League of Nations, cut short by a protectionist turn in the 1920s and the 1930s, picked up again at Bretton Woods with the creation of what we now consider to be the modern multilateral system, struggled a little bit in the 1970s as we came to terms with shifting out of a fixed exchange rate system to a flexible exchange rate system, but we got that right in the end, deregulated finance, up the ante on the trade front with the Uruguay round by making it a more expansive effort, bringing developing countries into financial markets in the late 1980s, early 1990s, signing up to NAFTA and further improvements on the trading system, more rules-based systems, creating the WTO, introducing the euro. This kind of Panglossian view, kind of Whiggish history of the world, in which somehow we've endlessly perfected the rules-based open system that, if you operate in my world, is endlessly praised by international bureaucrats and policymakers of one stripe or another. And as Ha-Joon rightly points out, that narrative quite clearly clashes with the kind of neo-mercantilist system that we operate in today, in which the rules of the game are very clearly rigged in favor of those who are already at the top of the pile, in which levels of inequality have both within and across countries have never reached the kinds of pinnacles that we've seen over the last 2 or 3 decades, in which we have a growth system that is incredibly dependent on high levels of indebtedness, that again we haven't ever seen before in history, and brings its own vulnerabilities and tensions and problems that particularly developing countries, but not only developing countries, have faced. And this disconnect between, you know, the talk of the level playing field, the talk about free trade and free enterprise, the talk about comparative advantages, this kind of efficiency driving machine, and the way in which this neo-mercantilist system works is incredibly stark, and poses all kinds of challenges, I think, to a progressive agenda. And I think to understand how we got there, it's very important to recognize that the kind of intellectual foundations of the New Deal, of the Bretton Woods system in the New Deal, and this is an American story. I think Ha-Joon doesn't talk about the hegemonic role of the United States, but you can't tell this story without recognizing that hegemonic role. But you know, the origins of Bretton Woods were very much in this very unique period of American history in the New Deal, as the United States discovered for itself that a strong state was the basis of a more inclusive and a fairer economy, and decided quite rightly that in an interdependent world, you had to take the values of the New Deal and somehow internationalize them through multilateral institutions, at the center of which, as it was in the New Deal itself in America, was the need to control reckless and footloose finance. The heart of the original New Deal, and the reason it was a success in the United States, was that Roosevelt was willing to take on the vested interests of finance to boost the strength of organized labor as a countervailing power to do so. And I think, you know, it was true of Harry Dexter White, as it was true of Keynes, that you needed to be able to make sure that finance was not only controlled at the national level and in the heart of finance in Wall Street, but also at the international level too, because footloose capital is incredibly destructive of efforts to create a more inclusive and equal world, and ultimately a world in which people have trust and faith in the institutions of government and governance. And to the extent that the Bretton Woods system worked, and it only worked for 30 years, it was because there was degrees of control of finance that allowed that sense of trust, allowed for the policy space that Ha-Joon quite rightly says is central to any sort of new international economic order to take root. And of course that was destroyed, that element of the New Deal, which was challenged very early on in the creation of Bretton Woods. There was already pushback in the 1940s against in the World Bank. Bankers were excluded from Bretton Woods consciously by the negotiators. But they began to push back very early. In 1946-47, the World Bank was already courting Wall Street, which I don't think was the intention of White or Keynes. And of course, most famously, organized business and organized finance was instrumental in undermining the idea of an international trade organization, which was the other leg of the Bretton Woods agenda to manage international trade, which was pushed back by the US Congress, leaving the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs as the only element of the trading system to complement the control of finance through the IMF and the World Bank. So I mean, and that system worked. I mean, there were lots of problems with that system, and we can talk about that. But it did work reasonably well, particularly for the rich countries, but to some extent for some developing countries too, precisely because it provided the kind of policy space that Ha-Joon talked about to design development strategies and economic policy in line with a country's particular institutional competencies and political needs. That system was blown up by the United States in response to the disruptions of the 1970s through what Paul Volcker, who is an instrumental character in blowing up the Bretton Woods system, what he called the controlled disintegration of the global economy, and what that essentially meant was letting finance letting the genie of finance out of the bottle and giving the governance of the global economy to essentially private financial interests. And that happens in the late 70s and the early 1980s very much pushing against the efforts of the developing world to forge a new international economic order in the 1970s that Ha-Joon talked about. But big finance won, organized developing countries lost that battle to restructure global governance in a way that would be fairer and more inclusive. And we've essentially been living through that world for the last 40 years, and it's hollowed out multilateralism in many respects. Or worse still, it's allowed multilateralism to be captured by large private interests, whether that's in finance or indeed in the real economy. The Uruguay round was very heavily shaped by pharmaceutical interests, by interests in the audio-visual sector. That's why we have intellectual property as part of the rules of the international trading system. And that's been the single, in my opinion, that's been the single most important feature of global governance since the 1940s. It's a fundamental break with the New Deal and the idea of internationalizing the New Deal. And unless we find ways of putting that genie back into the bottle, I think it's very difficult to advance with the kind of agenda that Ha-Joon rightly says is needed to build a fairer and a more effective multilateralism that can address these big challenges of climate change, inequality, the new digital technologies, etc. So I think I agree. I mean, I agree with what Ha-Joon said, but I think we need to have a very frank discussion about the way in which footloose capital, both financial capital and non-financial capital, has achieved a very, very strong position of power in the international arena, uses international institutions and rules to further strengthen its position. And I think going back to Ha-Joon's first point about Joe Biden, I think a lot of the future of the multilateral system will hinge upon whether Biden himself is willing to go down the Roosevelt route of controlling unregulated finance, Wall Street, in his own backyard, because in a dollarized world, Wall Street remains the center of economic and to some extent political power. And I think that is the big question when we look at Biden. We need to ask ourselves, is Biden more like Roosevelt or more like Harry Truman? And I fear that the answer is Biden is more like Harry Truman. And that is going to make the task of progressives to address the climate, environmental, and health challenges all the more difficult going forward.
Richard, thank you so much. I knew we were right in inviting you to come in such a short 10 minutes to put such pointed remarks. Ha-Joon, before we sign off with our YouTube audience, would you like to come back for just a couple of minutes so we have a time for Q&A afterwards?
Yeah, thank you, Richard, for those comments. I completely agree with you. I mean, the footloose finance is the biggest problem. I mean, I concentrated on the trading system, investment regimes, and intellectual property rights. But yes, I mean, that's that one aspect that I didn't talk about, and that is very, very important. So yeah, I mean, no disagreement there. I mean, thank you for pointing that out. I mean, just one comment on the New Deal. You know, people often think New Deal is about macroeconomic policies, about government spending. It's not. I mean, it's not even Keynesian, because when you think about it, the New Deals were in 1929 and 1933, the two New Deals, and Keynes didn't even write his general theory until 1936. Yeah? So that is very kind of British, even Cambridge-centric the thing to call New Deal Keynesian. It is actually founded on American institutionalist school of Beveland, Mitchell, and so on. And yes, it was mainly about the institutional reform with a view to changing the political power balance. Yeah? I mean, Richard said it, the Glass-Steagall Act, constrained the financial sector, the Wagner Act that strengthened the unions, the Social Security Act that gave the workers stronger bargaining power because they didn't have to worry about starving to death as much as they used to. So these institutional reforms that were intended to change the political balance of power was at the heart of the New Deal. And however much that Biden and others talk about Green New Deal and so on, without that willingness to make institutional reforms to change the political balance of power, it doesn't deserve the name New Deal and will not succeed. And yeah, I mean, I share your skepticism about Biden. You know, his wing of the Democratic Party is beholden to the Wall Street as much as the Republican Party is. You know, they may do fewer crazy things and maybe willing to make a little more concessions to poor people, but essentially they are the same people. And yeah, in that sense, there isn't the huge amount of hope there. But you know, we have to argue for the maximum, and then you might get something. I mean, if you become too realistic and begin to argue for what is only feasible tomorrow, then there are very few changes we can make. So yeah, I'm very glad that Richard pushed me even further to make those outrageous demands that put the financial genie back into the bottle. I think that's the key to.
We're all prisoners of hope, Ha-Joon.
Thank you.
Yeah, I try to live by Antonio Gramsci's motto that you need pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. So
I think this is a really good note to say goodbye to our YouTube audience, and hope everybody rejoins us next Friday for Akasua Ampolho talking about decolonizing academia. And all the rest of you, please